Thanks, Miles. As he said, I'm Dan Schell, Editorial Director of Life Science Leader, and today we are talking about a topic that some people think is either overblown or full of hype, or in some way, shape, or form is the future of clinical trials. Of course, I'm talking about decentralized trials, or DCTs, and I have three awesome guests today who all have 20 plus years of experience, not only in the industry, but with clinical trials in general. So I'm not going to read their long bios. You can check those out on the registration page, but we have a lot to cover today, so let me introduce each one of them. Going alphabetically, we have Dr. Phil Ambery, who is Global Clinical Head at AstraZeneca in Sweden. Phil, I know it's early evening there in Sweden, so I appreciate you working late for us today.
No problem at all, Dan.
Next, we've got Dr. Daniel Fox, the founder and CEO of the Clinical Research Payment Network, or CRPN. Dr. Fox does a lot of LinkedIn live streams, and I bet a lot of you have seen those and you're familiar with him. Dr. Fox, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here, Dan. It's a pleasure.
And finally, we have a guy who just wrote a great article for our Clinical Leaders site. It's called When Workers Are Down, Clinical Leaders Must Rise Up. Check that out. He's Dr. Oscar Segurado, the Chief Medical Officer of gene therapy company ASC Therapeutics. Oscar, thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much. Elated to be here and for all your support.
I also want to acknowledge our producer behind the scenes, Miles Skoda. He's the guy that you heard with the voice at the beginning with the housekeeping issues. I'll refer to him periodically throughout our event today. He's going to be posting the poll questions and keeping me up to date with all of the questions that you send through the chat function. So don't forget about that. So first, let me say, I know that this is not a new topic. It's been discussed for years ad nauseum throughout our industry, on our own Clinical Leaders site, our other Life Science Connect sites. But that's one of the reasons that I wanted to talk about it today. And it's one of the reasons that I put the word opinions in the headline of this live event. I want to hear from you out there through that chat function. And at the end, we'll cover some of your questions. And we've got those poll questions that we're going to be posting throughout the hour. Miles, let's post that first one, actually. It's a pretty basic question. Is there a better term for DCTs? A lot of folks have talked about that over the years, so take your time to answer that, and we will jump into our discussion. Now, interestingly, one of our pre-registrants, Ole, he wanted to hear about some of our panelists' real-life experiences with DCTs. So how about each of you tell me about the DCT that you've been involved with and what was the decentralized nature of those trials? Because we all know that decentralization could mean an element, a component, as compared to something that's fully remote. Also, when you talk about it, tell us why you chose that decentralized element for your trial. Phil, you're in Sweden. Give us a little bit of background of what you've been doing with DCTs.
So you might argue that really the prototype of these decentralized trials have been trials in type 1 and type 2 diabetes that we've run for years and years and years, really. And actually, that's not unsurprising. The technology there, for example, for measuring glucose remotely is fantastic. You can have an indwelling sensor, you can wear it for 2 weeks, it checks your glucose 30, 40 times a day. But then I have to confess, really, I've been enthused by the kind of explosion in cloud computing that happened in maybe 18, 19 or whatever, and then companies coming in offering me blood pressure meters that could measure blood pressure at home, weighing scales, connected this, connected that. You only have to have a little hub in the corner of your room at home, and then you can really monitor so many things remotely. And so with that in mind, in 2020, 2021, we instigated a kidney trial, actually. And as part of that, we built in remote weighing scales that would check for fluid retention every day. We built in an iPad that was alarming for when patients hadn't taken their medication or hadn't weighed themselves properly. And we had a remote blood pressure monitoring that would tell us a lot about pulse and blood pressure in patients during the course of the trial. So not sure if you want me to go into the pros and cons now, Dan, or if you want me to save what actually happened until later on?
No, why don't you share that with us now? Yeah, I mean, because that's immediately the question that I was thinking. So how did it go?
So I'll be honest, it wasn't perfect. You can imagine quite a lot of tech companies that try to promote ways to monitor patients remotely. They often try the devices out on 30-somethings or students in their tech lab or whatever, and then you translate that to your dad or to your granddad who could be in their 70s or 80s, and actually asking them to wear a blood pressure pulse strap around their arm that looks like a tourniquet, to use an iPad when they haven't got their right glasses on, to use a weighing scales that maybe won't transmit brilliantly well to your Wi-Fi hub if your Wi-Fi hub's in the wrong room, or if your internet's a bit slow because granddad's teenage grandsons are streaming live movies or PlayStation 5 upstairs or whatever. You begin to run into problems, then you kind of get the gist. And then we put all of our sites into a personal hell, to be honest, because actually we then had the iPad that was alarming to the sites when the data was missing. And what the sites told me was they found it very alarming when these alarms would multiply and grow because no one answered them. And eventually, a number of the sites would spend the whole afternoon answering alarms from their patients who hadn't quite hit the right bit of the iPad. So you can kind of get the gist of where I'm going with this, really, that it wasn't perfect.
Right. Yeah. And, we've heard those types of stories over the years, and those are big concerns that a lot of folks have, especially with the adoption of technology for some of the patients and everything. But then, of course, there's the cost and the site side of maintaining and managing all that too. So that's great. Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that with us. It's interesting. One of our pre-registrants, Elizabeth, she actually asked if big sponsors are ready and willing to use the DCT model for their studies. So in AZ's case, the answer is yes, but it's not a perfect science, obviously. And you got to have the right fit for everything. Oscar, much smaller company, ASC Therapeutics. You're a small startup, 20-some employees. Talk to us about your DCT experiences.
Sure. Maybe I need to provide you a bit of brief background about our company.
Please.
We have an R&D program on gene editing using CRISPR-Cas9. Another program is for allogeneic cell therapy in hematologic malignancies. But the program I'm going to use as an example of DCTs is our gene therapy for a second-generation hemophilia A. And in this program, we, as you know, in gene therapy in general, we have just one single day where we provide the investigational product, and this is the infusion day. And obviously that needs to happen in our with our PI and in the top site that we are using for all our patients. But in many cases, and I'm going to describe one of them, we need to make sure that the patient is also able to have all the very complex follow-up that is required in these clinical trials. For gene therapy, we have not only to take into account all the efficacy parameters. In the case of hemophilia A, we need to look into factor VIII activity. Factor VIII is the coagulation factor missing in these patients. And besides that, we need also to take a number of vital signs. We need to ensure also that we take several other lab parameters. And in many cases, because it's not so easy to find those patients, we need to adapt to the needs of the patient. And recently, we had an example of a patient that was living about 150 miles away of our PI site. And what we did was to adapt to his needs. So we ensure that we engage local HCPs. We ensure that we activated also a plan that we had already for our entire clinical trial through mobile clinical services, which was, by the way, a part of the of our CRO. And again, as you mentioned, we are a small organization, but basically everything works through CROs, CDMOs for manufacturing and so on. And we also have a company that also provides all the elements that are required to ensure that all the kits that are necessary for assessing these patients are either at the central site or at the home of the patient. So we adapted everything to not only the way this patient was located, but also to his needs in terms of his work schedule. So we were able, through this, it's called MCS, part again of the CRO, ensuring that everything that this patient needed was provided in at least one day of every week, because we wanted this patient to go to the central to the central site once a week. But the other day is everything at home, and sometimes even outside of his workplace. So we are adapting everything to ensure that everything happens there. I'm just describing at this point the logistics of what we did, but there are several aspects related to ensuring that the case report form is completed the right way, that we have also our risk management. So again, I guess we are going to go into that in more detail.
Yeah, so I was going to say that's got to be a heck of a lot more complex for you guys than running a traditional site, but you used the word adapt about 10 times in that. You're adapting for that patient, which is really, part of the crux of what a DCT is about. It's just not making it the same for everybody, what's best for that patient. Dr. Fox, I was going to lean on you near the end of this to discuss a lot of the regulatory stuff, but do you have anything else to add here? Any firsthand DCT experiences?
So it's interesting from a site's perspective. The one thing I could say is sites have been very creative with DCTs. And maybe one thing to consider is when you really boil DCT down, it's essentially community outreach. It's what it is. It's just a matter of reaching out to your community to try to get people engaged and involved in clinical research. Again, the local site, the people who are on the front lines for the patients, they've been doing this since before the billions of dollars in investment hit the market. All of the creativity that has to do with engaging with your community was already happening. And guess what? They were not paid for it. That was part of their job. So that's the first thing I should say. We, as clinical sites, are really good at DCTs, and we don't get paid for it. The other thing that I really should say is, and again, we've been doing this for a while. I remember when COVID hit, I was invited onto DCT advisory boards and guidance boards as a site subject matter expert. And I remember seeing these emergency DCT companies come into play because they wanted to help COVID and they wanted to do all of this. And they started putting all their plans together. This is how we're going to solve this. This is what we're going to do. And all of the sites set up and said, if it was really that easy and we were allowed to do that, we would have already done that. The FDA has steel corners. And then the FDA all of a sudden forgot those steel corners because they were kind of desperate. We had to get COVID done. And so we involved and engaged a number of DCT companies who were doing things that weren't necessarily kosher on a normal site level. They were, it's like a lot of the sites are saying, if we were allowed to do what DCTs were allowed to do during COVID, we would have done a lot of research by now.
Yeah.
So that's one thing to say. But the other thing is, as far as DCT selection goes, yes, absolutely. Most of the time when it comes to DCT, it's pushed down from the sponsor through trials for sites. And at first it was, home health care here and there, phlebotomy and some of the things like that. But then it turned into weird things, like maybe what Phil was saying. There was one DCT company who sold a service where patients had to download an app that watched them take their pills. It's just really weird, odd technology. There was another one where a patient had to take a pill and then on their app on their phone, see how the pill followed their digestive tract and all the metrics, and that would be going over. So it just got really extensive. But then kind of like what Phil was saying, I was part of that hell where every DCT company, every trial per every patient was pretty much the same amount of work as a trial each, because of the amount of technology, training, management, logistics, oversight on the end user level. Yeah. So it wasn't great. I'll admit it wasn't great, but I think it wasn't great because it wasn't streamlined into an industry. Everyone was trying to do their own thing.
Yeah, it's become very clouded as far as what DCT is, which is what led me to that first question. You know, with both Oscar and Phil's examples, you know, whether it's nurses coming to a home or, you know, remote monitoring, I mean, those types of elements have been around for a long time, and they're fine, you know, for a specific type of trial, you know, but then it kind of grew, like you were talking about, into this DCT industry, and then it gets really confusing as to what is what, and the technology vendors. That kind of leads us into our next poll question, because you mentioned the FDA guidance, and that's a big concern for a lot of folks. And in the pre-questions that I got, there were a lot of questions about regulatory guidance. So, Miles, can you launch poll question number 2? What are your biggest concerns regarding the FDA guidance on DCTs? It gives you a few different opportunities to respond there. And let's move into our next question for the panelists. Again, this is something that a lot of our pre-registrants asked about. Has the role of an IRB changed or evolved in a DCT trial world? For instance, Oscar, you and Phil, was there anything different with your IRB approval processes when using telemedicine or remote nurse visits? Anything different? Phil, go ahead. You can start.
Yeah, there was actually. So one big concern that we see from IRBs is around privacy and about hacking of electronic communications, and also recording of PII. So I would give France as an example, with one company's app for recording compliance, because they actually stored the data on the cloud out of the European Union. The ILBs immediately refused to let us use the app, and we eventually had to find a workaround. And again, there are privacy concerns when we looked at things like kind of geofencing. So can you tell when Mr. Jones had been on the hospital land or whatever, and then maybe we'd missed an adverse event, and that would then trigger calling up and speaking to Mr. Jones and saying, are you okay? We saw you were at the hospital. And there was a lot of concerns raised around doing that, because clearly for privacy purposes, much as with the government of South Korea during COVID being able to tell where its citizens were going to some slightly alternative establishments, there was a lot of concern raised by the ethics committees on that front.
Interesting. All right. Oscar, how about you?
So let me link your question on IRB to the FDA guidance from late last year. I was reading that in preparation for this conversation, and I realized that some of their guidance in some way applies to what we are already doing. And this is that the FDA recommends to engage central IRBs. And that's because they want to make sure, since there are now not only the actual traditional site, also we are engaging local HCPs, that a central IRB is going to be able to take a look that goes beyond just being responsible for the site, which is centralized site. And that's exactly what we have noticed, that when using a central IRB, it accelerates the way we not only look into the way the e-consent, the electronic consent form from the patient relates to the central site, but also to the interactions that they are going to have with their local HCPs, with their mobile nurses, and not in my case, but in any cases where there are wearables or other type of digital health technologies. So I think that's where I'm seeing that there is a good synchrony between what the FDA is saying and what is happening to us. So again, the point is that obviously we all need to ensure that the IRB works efficiently, and having a central IRB also, because we have different sites, and there is also more consistency across those sites. At the end of the day, what we're looking at, it doesn't matter if it's a traditional centralized clinical trial or a decentralized clinical trial. At the end of the day, what the FDA says in the guidance, and what is obvious, is that we need to ensure data integrity and quality. And obviously, especially from a safety perspective, they want to make sure that we are able to cover all those bases in the right way.
Can I just chip in as well to the conversation again? So one of the other concerns is actually, and I'm sure Oscar's probably found the same thing, that many of the devices which are approved for use as a medical device are not things that are intuitively easy to use. So actually, quite often people come up with a new, lovely, modern device to measure blood pressure, but it's actually not approved for measurement of blood pressure by the regulator, and you can't actually use it. And then you go to your supplier and you say, well, actually, what piece of kit can I use? And it's often something, as I was talking about earlier, that looks like a tourniquet that you have to wear permanently around the arm, and you then ask patients if they like it, and they say, no, of course they don't. Why can't I have an iWatch, or why can't I have a latest version of a Fitbit or something? And you then have to go through the realms of explaining them, well, actually, these are seen in the minds of the regulator as a toy, and they're not approved as a medical device. So that is also a major pitfall with the regulator. And I think one of the things I'd love to see is more of these really intuitive devices approved much earlier in the process for use as a medical device.
Dr. Fox, anything?
Yeah, so it's actually a mixture of two. I agree with Phil and Oscar. One is, as we become more dependent on data and data exchange in more of like a community setting, absolutely the IRB has been striking that down, trying to be very cautious about HIPAA, about patient safety and privacy. The other thing, and we can point to the FDA guidances, and this is a prediction, this hasn't happened quite yet, but in the new FDA draft guidance, there is a citation that protocols will require definition of visits that will be DCT compliant, which means what we're going to see in the future is, in fact, the IRB having to view each visit of a protocol on whether or not that is capable of being a DCT performed visit. So it hasn't happened yet, Dan, but it's coming down the pipeline where we're going to see there's going to be a really massive shift in IRBs when it comes to the acceptance and adoption of DCT.
Got it. Miles, can you show us the answer to poll question number 1? Are any of these a better term for DCTs? 31% for hybrid, 31% DCTs fine to use. Okay. All right. There's been a lot of discussion about that. I thought distributed would get a lot more on that one, but that's interesting. All right. Let's jump into our next question. Remember, you'll be able to review these poll questions after the event when it's on demand and everything. So in November of 2022, the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, the ACRP, released a report on DCTs that included responses from 291 clinical research professionals employed at clinical trial sites in a broad range of roles. So 291 folks answered this survey from the ACRP. I wanted to get your feelings on 3 of the main takeaways from the report. And Miles is going to put up each one as we discuss them. The first one is DCT technology utilization lags behind other trial technologies. It's interesting. It says, for example, less than 1/2 of sites report currently running trials that use DCT components or services, and sites rarely use remote technologies that could support patient convenience. So maybe those iPads that Bill was talking about, or some type of remote monitoring. Anyone want to jump on this one?
I'd love to if Oscar and Phil are okay with that. I'll point to let's look at the track history of the industry. When did the FDA put out the guidance that it's okay to use electronic formats for clinical trials? It was like 2008, 2009, I think, is when the guidance came out. Do we know what the percentage of sites are that are actually utilizing electronic formats for their clinical trial operations?
According to this, it's low.
No, and this isn't even DCT. This is like CTMS, eReg, eSource.
Okay. Yeah, just in general.
We're talking about electronic management formats for clinical trials. Even when the FDA said it was okay, over 10 years ago, we're at about a 28% adoption rate.
Paper's still the primary
thing,
right?
So people, the dinosaurs are retiring. That's part of it, especially in eReg. But the point is, it's really slow for industry, for sites to adopt technology. Now, we could root cause that all the time, but that's one of the main lags, is just look at the history. It's not necessarily the reason, but I'm not surprised, honestly. I'm not surprised that we're lagging this. Maybe by 2050, we'll have like 30% DCT adoption.
Yeah, the industry's not known to be a early adopter by any means, or a fast adopter. But Oscar, Phil, does this surprise you that DCT technology lags behind other trial technologies?
It doesn't surprise me, and that's because first of all, we have to think that many of those trials that the people were thinking about were trials that started already several years ago. A trial takes many times, especially pivotal trials, and we have to think that, I would say in some way, that there was an explosion of digital health technologies with the COVID pandemic time around 2020. When I joined ASA Therapeutics in 2019, I started working immediately on planning for my phase 1/2 dose escalation trial. It's a relatively simple trial, but I was in the midst of basically selecting a CRO and with already my initial clinical synopsis and clinical protocol ready when the pandemic hit. And it was sudden. So it was, again, the first quarter of 2020 when not only us, but also the CROs that we were already talking to and the one that we selected started talking to us. Okay, we have to do something. Either we start incorporating some of these decentralized approaches, or you are not going to be able to enroll patients for this relatively small trial, 8 to 12 patients. But what I noticed is that the CRO already acquired a company that was doing mobile clinical services, and they present that to us. We like that, and we were probably one of the first users of this approach. So again, what I think is that this is an evolving process. Is going to take some time for everyone to adopt it, because yes, we are in some way a dinosaur infrastructure in both pharmas and biotechs, and at the end of the day, we want to make sure that the FDA is not going to have any red flags for us. So we are very careful. This is a very conservative industry. And this is happening, but we just mentioned that the guidance from the FDA just came up less than 1 year ago. So it's logical that everyone, we need time. And I would say that for new trials, when we start, and I will start one in allogeneic cell therapy very soon, I will definitely incorporate several of these ideas. And this conversation, everything that we are reading, is going to be very helpful for the entire industry.
It's interesting. Before we went live, and when we were talking off line, Phil, you had talked about going to different conferences, and oftentimes there were people there pitching you all sorts of technologies and things that you may or may not have needed at the time. And I would imagine since COVID, that has increased the amount of technologies that have out there for however you define DCT.
Yeah, completely right. But the one point I was going to add is, to an extent, I think my kind of use of this type of technology in trials has been a little bit like you meet a new girlfriend, you want to spend lots of time with them. So actually, right at the beginning, maybe you go back to 2019, you think, well, actually, all this kit's fantastic. We have to put lots of this into trials. And then maybe you realize, yeah, maybe they're okay. Maybe you don't need to spend that much time with them now. And you then kind of slightly row back a little bit. And you say, well, maybe we could do with slightly less. And so maybe to an extent, at least, some of that DCT technology utilization has lagged behind now a little bit. Because maybe, maybe we're a little bit jaundiced with the quality of the kit, and maybe it's not quite as beautiful as we thought 2 or 3 years ago.
Got it. Greatest explanation ever.
You remember the days of you remember the no going back days, Phil? No going back. This is DCT. Do it or be a dinosaur and be extinct. You remember that? I love that campaign. And now I'm looking here because when it happened, I said, but DCTs, there's so many things wrong with them right now. I mean, the potential's there, but you guys are just rushing it in. Haste makes waste, my friends. And
exactly,
we could have predicted this, but people were in a hurry.
It kind of leads us into our second takeaway from this report. DCT technologies seem to be an encumbrance rather than an enabler. For instance, sites that use DCT elements spend more time on trial delivery activities than sites not using these technologies. In addition, some sites need frequent support and experience issues collaborating with stakeholders on DCTs. I'm reading right from the report. Guys, encumbrance, what do you think?
Oh yeah, I would completely agree. I would think if I was a site, and having had the sites when we were discussing the trial I described, I offered them a moaning session whereby they could join to spend an hour and effectively manage to vent their spleen at me. Quite a few of them joined to vent their spleen at me, and it was just around how hard this kit was to use. And like I was saying, at least a couple of times, it's at least partially responsible is the quality of the kit, and it's also the time we spend explaining to patients and to sites how to use the kit. So we all have virtual meetings for sites now. You get half an hour of a tech person who might have never seen a patient in their life talk you through how to use a piece of tech A, B, C or D, and actually we're surprised when the sites struggle and they try and ring up a call center to get advice, and the call center's in India, and they spend 3 hours on the phone waiting to speak to somebody, and they don't really get the advice they want. And I'm not surprised. The sites just want to put the stuff in the bin.
Mm-hmm.
I totally see that there is an encumbrance going on here, and at the end of the day, there is also benefit. So this is all about finding striking a balance between both things. And I can tell you that usually I have regular meetings with my CRO, obviously to take a look into the entire program. But now I also have another meeting with the mobile clinical services team. And this is an extra. In addition, when there are local HCPs involved, we also need to vet them. So we need to see if they have the capabilities that are required to follow up that patient. The one I mentioned at the beginning today, where we need to make sure that the patient is able to reach the center, to get all the coverage that he needs, that he understands also everything related to risk-based monitoring that is absolutely critical for especially gene therapy, also for many other trials. So at the end of the day, it's all about ensuring that we understand that we are going to need more time and more costs. So decentralized clinical trials mean that these studies are increasing in terms of the cost for the sponsor, the time that we have to spend. But the balance also there is that we're going to have a study that is going to be more diverse, more equitable, is going to be more inclusive, because we're going to have patients that don't live around one of these traditional sites in big cities. So now we're starting to get a more real world type of study, and I think that's essential. And something that I've also noticed is that we are able to enroll more patients. And again, I come to my first example, a patient that would never have been available to us unless we had a DCT elements associated to our clinical trial.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are denying the fact that DCTs can be helpful, right? More, like you said, Oscar, more diverse, more patients, all those traditional benefits that we hear so many times, So I don't want folks to think that, everything is negative around this, but it's also not simple, right? Implementing these elements is going to be very, I've used the word 100 times, complex. And some of the questions that are coming in, I can see are around that, shouldn't you plan for, Michael, I'll read yours just off the top here. It says, don't you believe DCTs need to be considered and planned for as a protocol as it's written instead of being layered on afterwards? Those types of considerations when you're planning ahead of time. Kind of, again, leads us into the third takeaway from that report. Site perceptions strongly influence
Do
DCT.
I get a chance, Dan?
Oh,
I had a
I'm
really
sorry.
good response for you.
Yeah, go, Dan.
All right, I'll go real quick because I know we really want to get through all our questions.
Yeah.
But there are two words in the world that quadruple the cost of anything. One is organic, and two is convenience. Anytime you add those onto anything, whether it's your travel hotel, at the hospital, the airport, the movie theater, convenience and organic will quadruple the costs of anything. So when you want to talk about a financial encumbrance, you're talking about these quotes, these RFPs going to our sponsors right now with a DCT component that has literally quadrupled the cost of what our sponsors are used to seeing. That goes to what Oscar was saying. We are literally trying to access more patients at an exponential rate at a smaller amount of time, which completely makes it a super duper expensive process. Sponsors are comparing that to their standard RFPs in traditional lines. And if you know anything about fair market value world, that just makes it a nightmare. They don't want that fair market value to inflate based off of DCTs. You're probably seeing that as an encumbrance for sponsors. On the site side, you're absolutely right. They're being paid standard RFP prices right now, and the market has not adjusted itself to pay sites for the amount of effort that they have to do for DCT. And so they are just not adopting it because, frankly, they're not being paid to do that kind of work. So I agree. Between the sponsors and the sites, our current environment will not make it an enabler. It's far more of an encumbrance.
All right. So that does kind of lead us into this next one. Site perceptions strongly influence DCT acceptance. So many technologies are not single sign-on. We've heard this plenty of times. It's a big hassle. You have a bunch of passwords that you have to remember from all those different technologies that we talked about, login procedures. Sites report that they would benefit from additional training and budget, Dr. Fox, to implement DCTs effectively. It's, again, not a simple implementation, right, for any of this stuff. And there's going to be a trickle-down complexity that goes on for the sites. Does any of this surprise you guys?
Not at all. So one of the things that we've done in AstraZeneca is we have pioneered the Unify platform. So this is indeed a single site sign-on for sites. And of course, the purpose of that is to make it easier to have all of these apps, all of these pieces of kit accessible from one website. Is it perfect? No, I'm sure it's not. I only get a chance to play with it as a global clinical head, and I think it's quite good, but I don't get a chance to see the teething troubles. But certainly I do agree with that comment about lots of passwords, lots of trouble, that type of stuff. And I don't think we engage with sites enough as to how important the pieces of kit are and how they should be using them. But we unfortunately often have a very constrained agenda for a study kickoff meeting, and there's too many virtual meetings these days, and not enough in-person playing the kit, testing it, hearing what people feel is going wrong.
That's a bigger discussion in general. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Oscar?
and I think that we should sometimes realize that we live as sponsors, as professionals in the pharmaceutical industry, in what I would call a technological ivory tower. We spend our entire day in front of our laptops. We use our iPhone. We use Face ID. We change our iPhone or our Galaxy phone regularly to be at the latest, but that's not the case for patients. Patients living in rural areas have conditions, and they watch TV, and they don't use these technological advances as we do. So to putting an iPad in front of them is a hassle. And even for them to realize that there is a Face ID and how it works, and sometimes they can be lucky, as I am, having kids that are my experts, and I go back to them. Okay, how do I do this? How do I do that? Which app should I use? They don't have that situation. So we have to realize that these patients, and especially if they're in a clinical trial, that means that they have any kind of serious condition, and we cannot ask more from them as to just put everything as easy as we can. So I'm not surprised that this is another hurdle that we need to overcome.
Dr. Fox?
Yes, sir. So this one's a really strong opinion of mine, and I'll keep it short because I really want to look at some questions. But I absolutely agree. The site's perception, they do strongly influence DCT adoption and acceptance. Number one is it's very, very fundamental. The independent contractor clauses that we have in a CTA don't just mean that sites don't get benefits from sponsors. There are a lot of things that are built around that according to the IRS and according to law. And part of that is that the services sites perform are 100% the site's discretion. So I think one of the things that we're looking at, and I like to use this analogy, if you were running a restaurant and every customer walked into your doors and said, you must cook my food with this spatula, and you must use it, my food and only my food, you have to use this spatula. And then let's say that you have 100 customers walk in and you have a kitchen filled with 100 spatulas. It's going to be really easy to get that mixed up. So you're going to have a reluctance for site acceptance of DCT until you empower the sites to make that discretionary choice on their own. We're doing this on a study by study, sponsor picks the DCT technology kind of a system. It's never going to work on a scaled system because you have to make that assumption. Similar to Phil, the AstraZeneca portal is great. I've used it. I do appreciate it, but my site does far more than AstraZeneca studies. We cannot live solely on AstraZeneca. We have to use the others. All of the e-thingies of the world get onto the shoulders of the sites as independent contractors, and it's just very tricky. I think that you're going to get to a point where we have a universal understanding, similar to Apple or Galaxy. There's some kind of a Play Store where we all make something the same way that can interchange and talk to itself, almost like an Amazon marketplace of technology. Then Sponsors will have a generalized universal understanding of what can be done in a trial, what can be built in a protocol, and we're going to be able to do this seamlessly. But we have to put it on the site's shoulders and their discretion, especially as independent contractors.
So that's all going to happen next year, right? Everything.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
it's only like a giant cultural shift.
Sure.
That it's gonna. I mean, I'll be lucky to see that in my lifetime, and
Right.
I know that the culture's there, but that is going to have to be what happens for DCT adoption to become the norm at the site level.
Got it. Hey, John and Carrie, you asked questions about the report that I was referencing. It's from November 2022, the Association of Clinical Research Professionals, the ACRP. If you go to their site, you'll be able to find that, and we will add that, I think, at the end of this. So when you can look at this on demand, you'll be able to link to that. We got a new poll question results for us, Miles. What do we got? What are the biggest concerns regarding the FDA guidance on DCTs, regulatory requirements regarding investigator oversight? That's the big one. Okay. Surprise anybody? How adverse?
The number one concern, I will tell you, Dan, and all of the public policy committees I've been in with all of the sites,
Yeah.
that is the number one concern. And not necessarily the investigator oversight, but there's a lot of language in there saying that sponsors make the selections for HCPs being provided. And there's a lot of concern that sponsors are making these decisions and PIs are on the hook for it.
Yeah.
And that's what happened in the home health too. CROs would come up to the site saying, hey, we're using this preferred healthcare vendor. And then that healthcare vendor messes up and then the PI eats the deviation. And that is number one. That's the number one reason. Everyone on the site level will say that.
Miles, can you launch that last poll question for us? Which of the following concern you the most about DCTs? And we're running out of time. This has been a great conversation. So I wanted to, Dr. Fox, is there anything that you want to summarize about that FDA guidance before we jump into some questions that you haven't mentioned already? Because I know we kind of jumped the gun on some of it.
So the PI oversight, the polls were exactly right. Whoever's listening, you were spot on. Number two thing, and there's a consensus, is they do believe that new documentation of task log will absolutely destroy the entire campaign. The logistics behind task log are virtually impossible to operate on a site level.
All right.
So I would like to add here that there is a gray area in the FDA guidance that I think relates also to the way the posters, the poll came up right now. And this is that the FDA indicates that there is no need to ensure that the local HCPs are actually included and registered, let's say, in the actual clinical study report or anything. But on the other hand, they're saying that we as sponsors, as CROs, need to monitor those sites. So I think that's a gray area because these are sites that are at the local level. They have never been involved in a clinical trial. And now from one day to another, they are monitoring and looking into a patient involved in a clinical trial. I think that's an area that requires more focus and more clear guidance from the FDA.
And that's the other one, Oscar, is all of the sites were hoping for guidance and clarity from this FDA guidance. And they are all very disappointed that now there's even more questions than there were before.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of the questions coming in and some of the ones that were sent in earlier. One of them from a guy with a weird name. His name's Dan. He talks about the trends for DCT and how to overcome regulatory ambiguities when internal regulatory team tends to err on the cautious side. That's a big challenge, right? And we aren't going to know anything until, what, the end of this year is when...
Yeah, publication is December 2024.
Okay, all right. Oh, so end of next year, 2024?
2023, sorry,
okay.
I'm a year off.
I thought it was this year. Okay.
Yeah, we're this year, end of year.
All right. Do you want to jump into some questions, guys? All right. Anybody, you guys want to pick any of those out that you that look good to you, or...
So I know that it popped in very early, but the one about site burden for data entry looked interesting. It was the very first one.
Okay. In terms of priorities, where does the relief from Scott?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of priorities, where does the relief of data entry and query management on the site in hybrid trials? Data entry is a big issue, right? I mean, it takes a lot of time. And
that's a big, Phil, how do you, I mean, this is a site level, but what do you hear from the sites about data entry and query management on a sponsor level?
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting because in one of our trials where we were having to use the home weighing scales, quite often the hubs actually were failing, and we wanted to use that as part of our submission to the regulator. And actually what we had to do in the end was to resort to paper diaries where the patients were using the scales, but because the internet wouldn't transmit and they were having to record all of these things. And not unsurprisingly, the sites were then going, well, actually, how can we put this into the CRF? And actually, we then had to compensate them appropriately for manually entering it all. And
Phil's breaking up a little bit.
That they integrate as part of the AstraZeneca platform and so on. I think as sponsors, we have to compensate the sites in an appropriate way.
So coming back to my point a moment ago about these local HCPs, think about in traditional clinical trials, we have a very rigorous approach to site initiation, site training, and monitoring of those traditional central sites. Now we have to deal with local HCPs, which have no clue about clinical trials, never involved on that. They are collecting data. They have to transfer this data to potentially a CRF or maybe just putting on paper and emailing that somewhere. All that usually without an actual training. So we need to probably clarify that, or the FDA or any kind of other type of body, to ensure that we help understand how we maintain data quality and integrity.
Now, I could say on that, because you cannot make the assumption that HCPs are the ones entering the data in your ECRFs or EDCs. There are technologies out there right now that provide virtual medicine of professionals who are clinically trained for research, who can guide those HCPs through the process. They can tell them, the HCPs communicate information to them, and then the trained clinical professionals can do that. I think that's the idea behind the task log, to create a list of healthcare professionals who aren't necessarily clinically research trained to perform standard of care activities under the oversight of the PI and the site personnel who are trained. I think that's because there's even in the guidance, there are situations that say you can either set up a system where the HCP can enter into EDC or ECRF directly, or through a telemedicine platform that's overseen by people who are fully trained. So I think hopefully that can provide some guidance or for some ease for the sponsors to know that it's not just that you have completely untrained people performing your trial. It's still under complete oversight, again, where the PI is. But that goes back to the sites are controlling that technology. It's the sites who have that oversight, that investment in the technology for the community outreach that we have. It's not study specific and it's not sponsor specific. It's site specific.
What would you guys say to Casey's question? Casey from AbbVie asked, what DCT component or service would you consider the most site-centric and patient-centric? I thought that's a good question.
What do you think, Phil and Oscar?
I mean, glucose monitoring, Phil.
I always use the term decentralized centricity. And by that, I mean ensuring that we not only decentralize the clinical trial, but they also we are patient-centric. And that's probably the key here, to ensure that everything that we do is having the patient as the centerpiece. My recommendation to everyone on what elements to start incorporating into a hybrid model, because I don't think it's easy to go full force into a DCT, is to start incorporating any kind of clear participation of the patient, training the patient on doing some things at home. And even without a mobile clinical services or something like that, could be just starting with an electronic consent form.
Mm-hmm.
It could be just asking them to complete a few questions or on their iPhone or something. So that would be, for me, the first step.
I'd say that, as you hinted at, Dan, glucose monitoring, Freestyle Libre, use of the Dexcom is really the poster child for a component of a DCT, which is there for patients and it's also there for the site, because it's kind of fire and forget, put the catheter in, make sure your phone's charged, make sure you don't go swimming in the sea for 3 hours and it falls off, and then you get really good quality data. The software is intuitive, reads it, translates the results using artificial intelligence often into something useful. What we really need to do is, as I hinted at right at the beginning, is really move that poster child that's really there for glucose only to creating the same thing for other monitoring of vital signs and so on, and then maybe the rest of it can move into to the 2020s really, rather than being stuck in 2010 somewhere.
Mm-hmm. So for any of you who know me, I'm a huge advocate in the autism community. I was a CEO of 2 autism nonprofits, and as a result, it opened my eyes to the challenges of our autistic populations and their family members, and most importantly, how they want to be in clinical research. They have comorbidities that are not just autism. There are comorbidities in CNS, there's depression, metabolic, cardiology, everything in the autism community that could help our research industry, but they are autistic. They have to have structure, and to ask them to leave a doctor's office that they know, choose, and trust will not happen. It's
right.
Complete torture. And so my answer to that question, both for the patients and the site, is the number one component to DCT is choice. Complete choice for patients and for sites. It's not strong arming. It's not, we will do it this way. It's choice. If a patient wants to go to their doctor's office to be part of it because they need that doctor's support during a diagnosis, they should be able to choose to do that. If they're more comfortable being at home because they're having depression disorders or they're having something wrong with that, it needs to be a choice. If a site wants to do the very best for their sponsors, they're going to have to choose the technology that works best for their SOPs and their situation. That, I believe, is the number one thing that we need to adopt DCT as a holistic industry.
Yeah, that's a great summary, great point about choice. I was just listening to Craig Lipset. He had talked about on some podcast about how he's never heard a patient say, I never want to go in and visit a site ever again. You know, I mean, there are patients that to them, that is a social experience for them, you know, and, you know, it could be what Oscar used the word hybrid. I mean, however you want to define that, it maybe the first three visits, maybe the nurse does come to their house, but then you say, hey, on visit 4, you're going to need to come in, but you at least give them those choices, you know, and it depends upon obviously what they're being treated for too. So, or being the research is for. We're going to have to wrap it up there, guys. This was great. I appreciate everybody that's been listening. Thanks for attending, asking all those questions. Thanks to our panelists, Phil, Oscar, Dr. Fox. Remember, you can access a replay of this webcast. It should be available in about 24 hours. Miles, sound good? Okay, he's nodding. You can use the same link that we used today to join. But overall, I thought this was a great conversation. Thanks for everybody, and we're going to sign off from there. This is Dan Schell. This is Clinical Leader Live, and we will see you the next time. Thanks.